Of all the love letters, homages, and eulogies to the 1980s that we've seen on the big and small screens in recent years, none struck a chord quite like Stranger Things. Season 1 dropped back in 2016 and was an unexpected smash hit, propelling its young cast directly to the A-list and enrapturing audiences with its Steven Spielberg meets Stephen King blend of horror, comedy, and drama.
I have a hunch it's going to be very popular.
But while the show may be set in the 80s, the technology that brings the show to life is cutting edge. Mostly. Now let's take a look behind the scenes at how they created Stranger Things.
I think it's something we ought to talk about, but not here.
From its very first episode, Stranger Things had an incredibly memorable aesthetic. From the title visuals and the synth-heavy theme music to the timeless feel of Hawkins, Indiana. This is because creators Matt and Ross Duffer, aka the Duffer Brothers, had a clear vision from early on in the development process. They wanted to tell a story about a missing child.
Yes, but that's not all.
From there, they started talking about the kinds of monsters that kids would be terrified of, which then led them to the idea of mysterious Cold War-era experiments. This enabled them to set the show in the 1980s, which would enable them to pay homage to the movies, books, and games they loved as kids. The Duffers decided that they wanted to create an 8-hour movie rather than a traditional show.
The television screen has become the retina of the mind's eye.
Netflix was their first choice of production company, and the streaming giant was so excited about the concept that it purchased the show within 24 hours of meeting them. Of course, even when production was underway, things remained in flux. A number of actors auditioned for the all-important child roles, including Skylar Gaertner, who you may remember as young Matt Murdock in the Netflix Daredevil show, and Jonah Bird in Ozark. But enough about the kids. How about the monsters? To help conceptualize the Demogorgon, the Duffer Brothers went to Aaron Sims Creative. Sims was an industry veteran who designed some of the creatures for 1997's Men in Black and had previously worked with Hollywood legends like Stan Winston. Now, although they initially only approached ASC for creature designs, the Duffers were so pleased with the initial results that the relationship ended up expanding considerably.
I am interested, a little bit.
The company helped the brothers with pretty much the whole supernatural aesthetic of the show, including the look of the Upside Down. In the original script, there wasn't much detail about what the Demogorgon would look like. The script just referred to a shadowed figure with a guttural, inhuman voice. The brothers knew they wanted a skinny humanoid figure with no face, but the designers were given free rein from there to come up with crazy, terrifying ideas, including the memorably disgusting way the creature's face opens up. Now, back in ye olden days, the company would have handmade a clay sculpture of the Demogorgon to show the filmmakers. But because of time and financial constraints, they 3D printed one instead. And we have to admit, the results were pretty cool. The Duffers clearly agreed. But of course, this was only the first step in bringing the beast to life. Now, having grown up with horror, sci-fi, and fantasy movies that used mostly practical effects, the Duffer Brothers initially wanted to go with that approach. They still went with animatronic versions of the Demogorgon wherever they could, but for the more action-heavy scenes, inevitably they had to rely more on CGI. Now, that's only the most obvious use of CGI, though. You might be surprised to learn how many of the more atmospheric effects made use of VFX, such as the goopy black fungus on Will's bathroom wall, and even the ever-present particles that float in the air in the Upside Down. And their props designer was given nearly $250,000 to track down as many 80s artifacts as possible. Sounds like she spent a lot of time on eBay. Now, Netflix was so pumped about the show that a second season was greenlit before season 1 had even started airing. The Duffer Brothers had originally envisioned either a single standalone season or potentially an anthology series with different seasons following different characters in different time periods. But they knew they had a hit on their hands, especially with their talented young cast, so they quickly started planning where the story could go next. Inevitably, they wanted to be more ambitious with their second season, seeing it as a blockbuster movie sequel in the vein of Aliens, Terminator 2, and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. They also planned to lean more heavily into the horror aspects of the show. Method Studios, who took care of much of the effects work, had to create and integrate spooky underground tunnels, otherworldly portals, corridors overgrown with alien creepers, and swarms of rampaging monsters. You can see from the before and after footage how extensive the VFX was, with real filming locations transformed to look pretty much unrecognizable under layers and layers of effects, some wildly colorful, some much more subtle. Now, all of this is made even more impressive by how tight the filming schedule was for Season 2, with every episode coming down to the crunch. Husband and wife team Paul and Christina Graff, who served as the senior VFX supervisor and senior VFX producer respectively, said that it was a roller coaster with basically no room to make a single mistake. Now that's scary. Though of course, it wasn't just the CGI and practical effects artists who had their work cut out for them bringing this madness to life. The production team were set on making everything scarier and more intense, from the action to the monsters, which meant that everything stepped up a gear for the young cast as well. All the kids were blown away by the new monster designs.
I was like, I don't even know what that was. I honestly didn't know.
But it wasn't just the massive Lovecraftian beasties that gave the young stars a challenge. Acting opposite Dustin's new pet Dart, a mostly CGI creation, required a more complex level of interaction than they had to do in the first season, with consistent eye lines proving particularly tricky. The kids also ended up pulling double duty as lighting technicians in the tunnel scenes, with much of the illumination coming from their own flashlights. Hey, probably cheaper than some big complicated lighting rig. And to top it all off, there were more straightforwardly emotional scenes. Remember the moment where Eleven reads Hopper's letter? Those tears for Millie Bobby Brown were very real because she hadn't read or heard the text of the letter before filming. Now, having intentionally left as few cliffhangers as possible at the end of Season 2, the Duffer Brothers started developing Season 3 with a relatively clean slate. Once again, the Duffers and their team looked to horror to get their creative juices going, drawing ideas from David Cronenberg, John Carpenter, and Sam Raimi, and movies like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Netflix also reportedly wanted Seasons 3 and 4 written and produced back-to-back because they were worried about Finn Wolfhard, Millie Bobby Brown, and the other kids aging too quickly out of their roles.
Get the hell out of my office!
But the Duffer Brothers pushed back on this, wanting to dedicate as much time to making Season 3 as good as it could be. And hey, if the kids get too old, they can always CGI them, right? Speaking of CGI, Season 3 saw things stepping up in that area too. Once again, the VFX artists had their work cut out for them, creating huge sci-fi machinery, disgusting slimy beasts, and glowing dimensional portals, as well as turning a pretty average-looking American street into a snow-covered military base complete with CGI helicopter. You can also see how they changed a guy in a red unitard with a big mirrored helmet into a terrifying monster. Although, we have to say, if we were being chased by a guy in a red unitard with a big mirrored helmet on his head, that would probably be scary enough.
It's for real. It's not acting.
The climactic Battle of Starcourt in the season's final episode was a hugely complex technical undertaking. Rodeo FX had a huge amount of work to do, from building the enormous mind flayer and integrating it into the real locations, to smaller details like creating Millie Bobby Brown's wounded leg. That's right, that leg was CGI. That is attention to detail, folks. From environments to weather effects to rats, both the running and exploding variety, the CGI artists worked overtime to make sure that every scene was as atmospheric as possible. Although, while we're on the subject of rats, you may not know that the team initially trained and prepared a whole crew of real rats for the production. However, those poor little dudes just weren't given the kind of Emmy-worthy performances that the filmmakers were looking for, so they handed over rodent duties to the VFX crew. Happily, while the rat performances weren't up to scratch, the kids brought their A-game as ever. Just look at how hard Millie Bobby Brown and the others sell their scenes, especially when they're battling the Mind Flayer. It takes real imagination to be that terrified of a beach ball, or to deliver a psychic smackdown on what is essentially some black material with tracking dots on it. Trust us, we do this kind of thing in our kitchens all the time. Don't you?
I don't know.
Which brings us all the way to 2022 and the 4th season of the show, which is due to drop later this month. Once again, the Duffer Brothers have said that they want to up the ante with the horror content, and actress Sadie Sink, who plays Max, warns us that it's going to be bizarre and out of this world with a really scary new villain. Like many shows and movies, production on Season 4 was interrupted by the pandemic, but the crew soldiered on. And interestingly, for the first time, the majority of the action will be taking place outside of Hawkins, with the Byers having moved to California and Hopper on vacation in Russia. Okay, he's not exactly on vacation, but he's definitely in Russia. And we can't wait to join him there, from the comfort of our lazy boys.
Yeah, thanks for nothing.
Now, as discussed, Season 4 will be leaning harder than ever into the horror side of things, with a whole lot of gruesome new imagery. They've even gone so far as to cast a bona fide 80s horror icon. Yes, it's Freddy Krueger himself, aka Robert Englund. Don't have nightmares, kids.